All right, in this video, we're going to cover at least part of our connective tissue. We'll probably break this up into 2 video lectures, but this will be the first one. So overall, what is the purpose or the function of connective tissue? So in the name, right, connect, it's going to connect tissues and organs. It also serves to support and protect. Now, most is going to be vascular. We'll talk about some examples that are avascular or don't have that blood supply. The interesting thing about connective tissue, when we talked about epithelium, we said there really is very little or no extracellular matrix. But in connective tissue, the extracellular matrix plays a very important role. So remember, the extracellular matrix is the part that surrounds the cells. The cells typically produce what is going to fill the extracellular matrix. So it can contain protein fibers and what we call a ground substance. In connective tissue, the cells are typically not directly connected close together to one another. They're going to be surrounded by this extracellular matrix. Now, we mentioned extracellular matrix has protein fibers. It can have different types of ground substance. So when we say extracellular matrix, we're talking about the collection of both the proteins and the ground substance. So as we talk about the different types of connective tissue, we need to understand what types of protein fibers can be present and what their function or what their features are. So collagen fibers, these are very prevalent in the body. These are very strong but flexible. They are resistant, however, to stretching. Okay, these are unbranched and they are white fibers. Reticular fibers are going to be branched, typically interwoven, which provides a toughness. However, they do have some flexibility. Elastic fibers are going to be the most stretchy, if you will. They have recoil. They can stretch and come back. They're made from elastin fibers or proteins, and these are going to appear yellow. Now, the ground substance is produced by the types of cells that are in this tissue. So we're going to look at the types of ground substance. And so we have everything from a fluid type ground substance all the way to a solid mineralized type. So when we talk about each connective tissue, we'll talk about the differences in what the ground substance looks like. And this is just an overview of everything that's included in connective tissue. So we have 3 major classifications, if you will. We have connective tissue proper, which is going to include both loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And we'll talk about the types of those. And then we have supporting connective tissue. And this is going to be cartilage and bone. And then we have fluid connective tissue, which includes blood and lymph. So today we're going to focus on the first classification, the connective tissue proper. We'll talk about loose and dense connective tissue and each of the types of those. All right, so in our connective tissue proper, we have different types of cells that are going to be present. So fibroblasts, so if you think about fiber, right? Production of fibers. Their job is to produce the protein fibers and the type of ground substance that's going to be found in the extracellular matrix. Now, we have adipocytes. These are cells that are going to store fats or lipids. And then we have mesenchymal cells, which are these stem cells that can continue to produce new cells in the connective tissue. We also have macrophages. These are cells from our immune system that can phagocytize or engulf pathogens or damaged cells. So in order to prevent pathogens and infection. Okay, so as I mentioned, under connective tissue proper, we have 2 general types. We have loose connective tissue and dense. And these basically describe how things are what's present, right, in the tissue. And in this case, loose means we have fewer cells and fewer protein fibers in the ground substance. dense connective tissue, we're going to have more cells and more of these fibers in the ground substance. So we have different types of protein fibers. We've talked about collagen, we talked about reticular fibers, we talked about elastic fibers. We've talked about cells that store lipids, the adipocytes. We've talked about fibroblast cells, which are the cells that are going to produce these protein fibers in our extracellular matrix. All right, now we're going to go through the types of loose connective tissue. We're going to start with loose connective tissue. So we're in connective tissue proper, loose connective tissue, and our first example is adipose. Okay, so adipose is going to be storage of fat. Okay, these cells are going to have very little extracellular matrix because the majority of these cells is just filling up with fat droplets. Now, these are very vascularized. In other words, there's a lot of capillaries that are found in adipose tissue. Now, if we think about fat, right, adipose fat, what function might that serve? Well, it's going to insulate us, right, help prevent heat loss, and it's also going to provide cushioning, right? We have fat to help cushion and protect around our organs and under our skin. Now, the other thing, though, is we know now that fats are our long-term energy storage molecule. So these cells and this tissue serves as a way to store our long-term energy storage molecule, these lipids. Now, we can have two types. We can have white adipose tissue and brown. So the white is less metabolically active than the brown. The brown is going to be present in high amounts in newborns. The white is more common in adults. Now, I already talked about this a little bit, but where might we find adipose tissue? And that's in the subcutaneous layer of the skin, or what's called the hypodermis. And again, we're introducing this in the next lesson. We will talk in detail about the skin, so you'll already know something about what makes up some components of the skin. And it makes sense, right? If these are cushioning and insulating, that would be important in our skin to protect against, damage, give us a little bit of cushioning, and help us in our not to lose heat. Now, also we find this around organs. Now, the interesting thing when we think about gaining and losing weight, the number of these cells, adipose cells we have, really doesn't change that much as we gain and lose weight. It's actually the cells themselves get larger or shrink as we gain and lose weight with the amount of lipid droplets that are stored. So let's take a look as we look at the tissue. Let me get my pen ready. Okay. So we have obviously a illustration on the left, but on the right, what I want you to look at is all of this white space that we see, right? And all of these round things, all that white space would be where the fat droplets, right? The lipids would be present. Now, when we sometimes stain tissue, we lose part of the tissue, but that would be where all the fat droplets would be. So we have a thin membrane, right, that's surrounding those fat droplets. And what we see is, you might look at that and say, well, wait a minute, that looks a little bit like when we looked at epithelial tissue and we looked at simple squamous around the air sacs. However, remember, in the air sacs, we had individual cells, right? So it would be like, there'd be a cell here and a cell here and a cell here. There'd be nuclei all the way around those air sacs, right? That we could see individual nuclei making up the air sacs. But that's not what we see in adipose tissue. Notice we see, here's one dark nucleus. So that's a cell, right? With the nucleus has been sort of pushed out by the fat droplets to the edge, right? Here we have a nucleus that's been pushed out, right, to the edge of the cell. So even though we still see some similarity in that they're round, it's very different because we only see one nucleus for each of these adipocytes. Okay, and we move on, and we have two types that we'll talk about on this slide. I only have one image at the bottom for the reticular type of loose connective tissue. I don't have an image in this presentation for the areolar. However, when we go to the lab section, we're going to cover lots of tissue samples. We'll look at some histology of each of those, and we'll talk through, in this case, we're talking about, the general, what's going on in the extracellular matrix, what's present, where are they found, and then we'll definitely look at some histology in more detail in the lab section. So the areolar is going to have few fibroblasts. We know that because it's loose connective tissue, few elastic and collagen fibers, and lots of vascular tissue, or lots of blood vessels. Where do we find this? So we find this in a special layer of the dermis. So we talked a little bit about, we have the epidermis, which is the outer layer of the skin, and then the dermis is deep to the epidermis. And this is a specific layer of the dermis called the papillary layer that we find this type. It's going to surround organs, and it's important in binding epithelium to deeper tissues. It's also going to be around blood and lymph vessels. Now, the reticular tissue, what you want to look at when you're looking at images of this is the presence of these mesh-like reticular fibers. So notice in the illustration we see, right, that we have fibers going different directions, and they're sort of weaving together. You could think of mesh or nets that it would be forming. The other important thing about the reticular tissue is the presence of what are called leukocytes. These are white blood cells, and so they're there to phagocytize pathogens. And so if we look at this microscopic image, it might be a little hard to see, but we definitely have these reticular fibers forming this net or mesh-like substance. And these darker areas are going to be the presence of these leukocytes that are there. Now, why might this tissue have so many white blood cells? Because look where we find it. We find it in areas where we might want to make sure that we are filtering for pathogens. All right, so we're under connective tissue proper. We talked about loose connective tissue. We are now moving to dense connective tissue. So it's dense because we have more protein fibers present in our extracellular matrix than the loose connective tissue. We have three types of dense connective tissue. We have dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. Okay, so our dense regular connective tissue, we know that it is going to have high amounts of the collagen type of fiber. And what we see is these fibers are arranged in a parallel fashion. So this first image up here, the top part, okay, is our dense regular connective tissue. So what we see is these collagen fibers are, you can see they're packed very closely together, running parallel. Okay. We can also see these darker purple areas. These are going to be the fibroblast cells that are producing these collagen fibers. But we see that we have few fibroblasts and many of these parallel collagen fibers, and not a lot of ground substance between the fibers. Now, what is the function? Well, this type of tissue, because of the parallel arrangement of the fibers, it's going to resist stretching in the direction of the fibers. Now, we don't have very many blood vessels in this dense regular connective tissue. Therefore, if you have an injury in this area, because you don't have a regular supply from the blood, it may have a slow healing process. Where might we find this tissue? Well, in tendons and in ligaments. And we'll talk about tendons and ligaments more when we get to talking about our muscular and skeletal system. But for now, tendons are what connect muscles to bones. And ligaments are typically going to connect to bones. Okay? Okay, now as we look at another type, the dense irregular, okay, so I've left this top one up here as our comparison. That's our dense regular with our parallel collagen fibers. our dense irregular, we still are going to have a lot of these collagen fibers, but we don't have them parallel. They're actually going in different directions. So what we see is we see stained red are the collagen fibers. So we have lots of these collagen fiber bundles, but they're not going one particular direction, right? We see them in many directions. Now we see that we still have fewer, right? We have few of the fibroblasts cells. But the difference in the function of this tissue, because we do have them in different directions, it resists stretching in all directions. We also see the presence of more blood vessels in dense irregular connective tissue. Now, where do we find this? Where's the location? Okay, remember, we talked about the skin, and we know that the epidermis is the outer layer. The dermis is then below or deep to the epidermis. The dermis is divided into layers, and it's specifically the reticular layer of the dermis that we find this dense, irregular connective tissue. In the next lesson, we will look specifically at the integumentary system, which includes our skin. So we'll learn more about how those layers function. We also find this connective tissue surrounding our organs. All right, our last example for this video is elastic connective, and it's right in the name. We expect this is going to have more stretch and recoil because of the types of fibers. We have more or many branched of these elastic fibers. Now, we do have the fibroblast cells that we're going to find packed between these fibers. Now, if we think about structure has something to do with function always, right? Where might we want to have stretch and recoil? Well, for one thing, our large arteries like the aorta. So think about when the heart pumps blood through the aorta, those walls of that large artery is going to have to expand and contract, right? So we're going to need a lot of this type of connective tissue in those walls. Also in our trachea and bronchial tubes. So join me for the next video, and we'll talk more about connective tissue. We'll move on to additional types of connective tissue.